Well, good morning and a very big welcome to this, our first HBF Live webinar. We've had a fantastic response to this event. I'm delighted that you can join us. So, of course, it would have been great if we could have met up in person, but one of the many consequences of the coronavirus pandemic is that my colleagues at HBF and I have not been able to run events and meetings as we normally would. But like all of you, we've made the best possible use of technology to maintain contact, and we hope that this series of webinars that starts today helps fit the bill in the meantime until we can meet up again. So we've got a great lineup of presenters at this event, which is scheduled for the next 90 minutes. We'll hear from HBF's Executive Chairman, Stewart Baseley, about the impact of the pandemic on the house building industry, its response, and what needs to happen next. I really am delighted that Nationwide's Chief Economist, Robert Gardner, is also with us today. Rob will provide a welcome insight from a lender's perspective and Nationwide's take on where we are now and what's likely to unfold. Lucian Cook heads up Savills' research team and is one of the country's most respected housing market commentators. Lucian is a regular contributor to HBF events, and I'm sure that today, like previous occasions, he'll have a great set of slides and a few quips to help us see the light side of current circumstances. And I can safely forecast that much of the humour probably comes at Stuart's expense. And finally, I'm delighted to welcome NHBC's Commercial Director, David Campbell. Still relatively new to his new role at NHBC, but someone I've known for very many years, David will provide an overview of NHBC activities during the pandemic. So we should have plenty of time for questions, so please do make use of the webinar functionality and get your questions in. And in the interest of managing our time, I'll seek to take those questions at the end. You're also going to see some polling opportunities today. There's going to be some interactive pop-ups on the right of the screen. We really welcome your views, which will help to determine the questions that we put to our presenters at the end of the event. Okay, so although our first presenter for the day isn't able to join us in person, he has sent a video message for the house building industry. Robert Jenrick was appointed Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and the Local Government in 2019. That's a big brief prior to the pandemic, and he's clearly been very busy since. So let's hear from Robert about his view on the house building industry at this difficult time.
Firstly, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but the fact we're speaking via webinar underlines just how impressively you as an industry, like so many others, have adapted to these extraordinary times. And it's not for the first time in your case. I know that HBF's roots can be traced back right the way to the eve of the Second World War. Then, as now, we were facing an unprecedented national emergency. And whilst the enemy and the challenges were of a different nature, Britain's house builders were at the forefront of our post-war recovery, as they are once again with the clear and comprehensive plan that I recently set out to reopen the housing market and to restart the construction industry. That was the most radical restarting of an industry as part of the first phase of our national recovery roadmap. And I want to thank HBF and all your members for your efforts to get us through this crisis so far, to get back to work and to get Britain building again. The pandemic meant that we had to take the most difficult decisions to keep the country safe. People had to put house moves and their lives on hold. Important work to build the homes that we still need was paused, whilst this most essential industry was put into a state of suspended animation. Recent statistics show that the number of homes started and finished have fallen by 81% and 91% respectively, and 91% of sites say that progress had stalled. I understand that many HBF members will be feeling the financial consequences this year. Nonetheless, the decision to reopen and to restart the housing market and the construction industry more broadly was not an easy one. With few, if any, transactions, there is really no visibility and no precedent with which to judge the state of the housing market. But let me be clear, to all who work in it and invest in it, who have invested their savings into it and rely upon it, I will do everything that I can to support you and to support the market to bounce back. And we can see positive signs that that is happening. And as we continue to tread with caution to control the virus and to protect the public, doing everything possible to ensure these changes take place safely. I want to pay tribute to the HBF and your members and your leadership in this important work, ensuring that the industry pulls together from getting your own sites up and running in difficult circumstances to sharing safe working protocols with the SME sector, to the HBF's pivotal role in launching the Safe Working Charter with my department. I'm delighted that so many HBF members have signed up to the Charter so far, helping all those working on site to feel confident that their key roles are also safe jobs. And I would urge any part of the industry that has not signed up already to do so. Together with the steps that I've already taken to allow more flexible working hours on construction sites and to bring the planning system into the digital age, together these measures will help the housing market and the construction industry to get moving again. And I hope to play its historic role in helping the economy to restart, to grow and to move forward. And we must never forget that the prospects of Britain's housing market are inextricably linked to the macro economy. Your success is our success. To build on this, which has seen us pushing output to around 250,000 homes a year last year, we'll continue to support you. Not just to deliver more homes, but safer homes, greener homes, more beautiful homes, homes embedded in true communities, homes of all types and tenures for all people in all parts of the country. With house builders, large and small, specialist providers, off-site manufacturers and others in essential supply chains playing their part. And with that in mind, I welcome Natalie Elphick's appointment as the chair of HBF's Housing Quality Board. I know she will be tireless in driving improvement for consumers before we legislate for the new Homes Ombudsman in due course. Working together, we have already achieved so much. And as we move forwards, HBF and your members will continue to be key partners in our shared endeavour to protect lives, save jobs, to refresh and renew our economy, to build a stronger housing market and a stronger country. Thank you once again for everything that you're doing to ensure that we will once again be able to look back with pride on the contribution made by Britain's house builders at another pivotal moment for our country. I look forward to working with you over the coming months. Thank you, and I wish you well for the conference.
So great to receive a message there from the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick. All very positive. So thanks to those of you who have taken part in the poll. Thanks to those of you who pointed out that not everyone is working from home and some of you are in the office. And thanks to those of you who have also already provided questions. Just to let you know, we are receiving those and we'll answer as many as we can during this event and certainly in this session at the end. Okay, so over to our next presenter who needs very little introduction from me. It's HBF's Executive Chairman, Stewart Baseley.
Good morning. Thank you, Neil. This is our first HBF Live event, as you've heard, and some 650 of you registered to listen in this morning. So that's absolutely fantastic from our perspective, and a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you also to the Secretary of State for his kind remarks, and also for taking some time out to come along and say something to us this morning. I think we all appreciate, whatever our views of what the government has been doing over the last 3 months, that cabinet ministers in particular, of course, are particularly busy individuals at this time. I've been in this business, as many of you know, for over 40 years, and I have to tell you that in that time I thought I'd seen it all, but frankly the last 3 months, the events of the last 3 months have been completely unprecedented and unparalleled, and I've never seen anything quite like this. So what I thought I'd do this morning is just recap briefly on how that 3 months has played out from an HBF perspective and from an industry perspective, what we've been up to collectively, where we stand today, how things are going out there today, and what's coming next in terms of potential economic support, and what the future might hold in terms of how housing policy could be affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Of course, time won't permit me this morning to talk about everything that I'd like to talk about, but we will have some time at the end to take questions, and I'd be delighted to try to answer those as best I can later in the event. So HBF, like every other organization in the country, had to think about how it was going to organize itself, think about how it was going to operate through these unparalleled crisis times. We spent the first couple of weeks of March ensuring our people were able to work remotely, work from their homes, making sure they had the right technology with the ambition, the aim to ensure that we provided you, our members, with as good a service, as excellent a service as we possibly could, despite the difficult conditions that we were all operating in. And we thought about that in terms of what were the most important things that we could do. First, we needed to understand what was happening to you, what your experiences were on the ground, how you were dealing with the challenges of having to close down your offices, but at that stage still operate on site. We wanted to make sure we had effective forms of communication with you and communication with government. And so our regular meetings, which many of you attend and which typically take place 2, 3, 4 times a year, were increased in frequency, turned into video meetings using Teams and Zoom. And we were talking to you through one method or another on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, ensuring we were absolutely up to speed with what was happening. And we were also open communication at the same time with government departments right across government, from number 10 and number 11 through MHCLG, who of course are our principal government department, but also with BAYS and with Homes England. And again, communication with them became daily and as regular as was necessary. And it was important that we made sure that government understood what was happening to you out in the field. And at the same time, we wanted to make sure we kept you up to date with everything that was happening. Government was producing announcements at an extraordinarily rapid rate. And so we decided to set up our coronavirus daily briefing, which hopefully you all receive, and also a dedicated resource page on our website where you can go to get access to information on a broad range of issues connected with coronavirus, not necessarily directly related to housing, but issues which would be of interest and concern to you. The home building industry, as I just said, went into the coronavirus pandemic knowing it was going to have to largely close its offices, but actually trying very hard to keep sites operational, certainly during the early days. But it became apparent very quickly after Boris Johnson's address to the nation at 8:30 on Monday, the 23rd of March, an event I suspect that for the rest of our lives we'll all remember where we were that Monday night at 8:30, when effectively he imposed conditions on the country unprecedented in peacetime, conditions in many ways even more extreme than people had to endure during the Second World War. And as a consequence of that announcement, that stay-at-home message, even though the government made it clear in the coming days that actually it was okay for construction to continue, for a whole variety of reasons, that didn't happen. In some cases, companies felt it was difficult to do so whilst respecting social distancing rules. In other cases, because the supply side of the economy began to shut down, the house builders followed suit. And also there was mixed messaging from government at that point. It's okay to keep construction going, but advice to customers and the public not to move, advice to solicitors to effectively enter into standstill arrangements on contracts, etc. And so that as a consequence, through that week of March the 23rd, gradually most of the industry was forced by one method or another to close down. From our engagement at that point with members, it was clear that you were concerned about a number of things. Small builders in particular were very concerned about access to finance to help keep them going. The business interruption loan scheme, known as Savills, became something which we became very engaged with in the weeks that followed. We also were helping people to navigate the difficulties with the furlough scheme, about which in the early days certainly there were a lot of questions as to exactly how it was going to operate. And we acted, as we often do, as a conduit between you, the membership, and the government to try to get satisfactory answers to those questions. But uppermost in people's minds was how we could actually get back to work in a safe fashion. What do we have to do to enable the building sites of the United Kingdom, but particularly England and Wales, of course, where we function, to be able to operate whilst respecting the government's rules, the Public Health England guidelines, and the social distancing rules that were in place. And so we began discussions in earnest with government about creating a charter, a charter which government would sign and which HBF would sign, a joint document which would sit as an umbrella document and not in any way intended to supersede any individual company's protocols, but to support them. And most importantly, to demonstrate to the public, who of course have got concerns at this point about the virus spreading through activity on building sites and elsewhere in the economy, to demonstrate to the public that we had got safe protocols in place. And at the same time, we also began work on sales protocols to demonstrate how we could open our sales offices and our show homes again in a safe way so that the public would be able to visit when they were allowed and actually continue the process of making sales, making reservations, which of course is the lifeblood of what we do. And alongside those discussions, we were talking daily to suppliers, to major suppliers, several of whom I know are on the line today, making sure they knew what the house builders were thinking, and in return, of course, making sure the house builders knew where the suppliers were standing, because what we wanted to ensure was that as house building came back online, the suppliers were not caught out by surprise and were ready to make sure that they could get their materials to site as required. And that all culminated in the week of May the 11th with a series of announcements which enabled the house building industry to get going again in earnest, enabled the sales market to open up. We were the first industry to be effectively allowed back to work in that sense, the first element of non-essential retail, but also much broader into the second-hand market, which is also so vital to us. 2/3 of our buyers are not first-time buyers. And it was essential to us to get the estate agents, and again, I know a number of you are in the room today, to get the estate agents, to get the whole second-hand market moving. And we also worked with the National Association of Removal Firms to make sure that they could also move people, of course, an essential ingredient at the end of the day, and making sure the transactions happen. And we lent our name to their protocols to show that we had been working with them and supported what they were doing. So this Herculean effort, as I say, by everybody concerned, enabled the housing market in its totality to be able to return to work in the middle of May. Although, of course, as you all appreciate, it isn't necessarily work as you know it, because by definition, we're not as efficient. Production levels cannot be as efficient when we're maintaining 2-meter social distancing rules across all the facets of what we do. So sales are being done by appointment at this point, as opposed to customers walking in off the street. And the number of trades that are allowed to be operating in individual homes has, of course, been restricted, and that means that building programs are taking longer. And the charter is on the screen, and I'm delighted that over 100 HBF members have signed it so far. And if you're not one of those, but you'd like to lend your name to it, just let us know, and we can, of course, do that for you. So here we are, about a month or so since the restart, and so far so good. We've been very pleasantly surprised by the level of productivity which builders have managed to maintain. We haven't heard too many stories about difficulties with supply, which is obviously excellent at this point. And equally, the interest level from the public has been somewhat better, somewhat higher than perhaps many of us anticipated. Of course, it's difficult to know at this stage, too early to tell. We are only a month in, and there's inevitably some pent-up demand being released, and a lot of people are still at home. So I don't want to get too carried away with this, but I think it's fair to say that sales so far have exceeded most of our expectations. And I say that right across the country. And so we start to think about what happens next, because clearly as the government starts to turn its attention, its focus is now very firmly on the recovery stage, as is evident from the knowledge that's in the public domain about work that's going on in government towards potentially some form of July or early autumn economic fiscal statement. We turn our mind to what our role in that can be. And as always, the home building industry is at the forefront, potentially, of economic revival, because we are such an important industry in the economy generally. We employ hundreds of thousands of people, both directly, who come on our sites and build our homes, but indirectly through all the trades and suppliers and the peripheral industries which support home building in the new homes market, but also the activity that's generated by home transactions in the second-hand market. In the new homes industry alone, we created something like 800,000 jobs in the last year, and we generated something like £42 billion worth of economic activity. And that makes us a very relevant player in terms of UK PLC's recovery. And so we've been turning our mind to what measures the government could potentially introduce which might help us help the UK economy to recover more quickly. The first important point I should make is that none of the measures that are up on the screen have been agreed by government. Indeed, they are in the very early stages of discussion in most parts. But it's also worth mentioning that the government is very interested in this area, and not just in talking to us directly, but also, I mentioned earlier, the Construction Leadership Council and the work that we do on that. And we've been asked by the Construction Leadership Council to lead its economic recovery plan for housing. And we're doing that with a range of other bodies that take part in the housing space. So clearly our number one ask, no surprise to any of you, is around Help to Buy. Firstly, of course, we're very concerned about the very acute problem that exists today around the December 31st practical completion date, the date that sits within the Help to Buy contract that you enter into as builders with Homes England. It's been there, frankly, since Help to Buy began, but this year it matters more because the existing Help to Buy scheme is currently slated to come to an end next March. And there are, of course, potentially tens of thousands of customers around the country who were expecting to move into a home in the autumn using a Help to Buy loan, but where those homes are now likely to be completed next year because of the delays to build programs caused by the shutdown in March and April and early May, and then the reduced or the impact of elongated build programs on the time it's going to take to complete those homes and enable those customers to move in. And as it stands, because the homes won't be necessarily practically built and complete by December the 31st, those customers would miss out on a Help to Buy loan potentially. And that's an area of extreme concern to us, and an area that we are in hot discussion with government about right across government at this point. And our aim there is, of course, to get that date changed somewhere around mid-March to enable those homes to be completed in the spring rather than in the autumn. The second point on Help to Buy is a bigger point, and probably a tougher point in many ways for government, in that we actually think it would be beneficial for government to think about not introducing the new Help to Buy scheme that's slated to start next April, but to continue with the existing scheme for the further 2 years of the life of Help to Buy. Why do we think that's the case? Because we know from historic data that around 40% of Help to Buy sales, and they currently run at about 50,000 sales a year, so roughly 20,000 sales a year, would not be captured by the new Help to Buy scheme because of two things in the new Help to Buy scheme. The first is that second-time buyers are excluded from taking part, and the second is the introduction of price caps around the country, which will exclude about 20% of first-time buyers that currently use the scheme from being able to take part as well, because they're buying above the price caps, depending upon where in the country it is. And so we think it would be sensible, given that Help to Buy plays a vital role in giving confidence to you builders to build, and indeed, obviously, therefore, keeping output levels up. We think it would be sensible for the government to not introduce the new Help to Buy scheme, but to continue the existing scheme. Now, that is not something that they've currently agreed to do in any shape or form, but that is our number one ask, as you can see from the list in front of you. We're also very keen to see measures to boost the second-hand market. I mentioned a few minutes ago that something like 2/3 of our buyers are not first-time buyers, and the vast majority of those, of course, will come, therefore, from the second-hand market with homes to sell, as a consequence of which we think a stamp duty holiday would help to generate activity in the second-hand market. And both of these measures are intended, the Help to Buy extension and the second-hand market points, are intended to help boost consumer confidence. And of course, nobody at the moment knows quite how consumers are going to behave, and none of us know what's going to happen in the economy generally and how much masked unemployment there is within the hidden furlough numbers that we're all seeing at the moment, 8.9 million people, I think, now on furlough at this point. But there is concern, obviously, that the economy is going to go into recession, and that clearly will dent consumer confidence. And therefore, our message to government is that whatever we can do or whatever they can do to improve consumer confidence will help us have the confidence to continue building homes at the appropriate level. And of course, that matters because what we do is not just economically important, as I said earlier, but socially important, because we build homes. We build homes where people live, where people raise their families. And HBF and others have spent the last 10 years or more trying to help the government and others understand the scale of the housing deficit in this country, the undersupply of homes that's been running now for the best part of 30 years. And we've made the most extraordinary progress. In the last 10 years, we've virtually doubled production from a low point after the last recession of about 125,000 homes a year to where we are today at around 250,000 homes a year. And clearly, 2020 is going to be an exceptional year, and it's going to see a decline in that 250,000 figure. And there's nothing any of us, frankly, can do about that. But we can potentially do something together about what happens in 2021. And clearly measures such as those we've outlined to government on stamp duty, on not introducing the new Help to Buy scheme, but extending the old Help to Buy scheme, would, in our judgment, help you collectively maintain housing output at a higher level than it otherwise would be. And it's not, this is something which applies across the market, of course. We are keen to see all builders flourish as best we possibly can. And that means a lot of attention is also going on within HBF to what could be done to help retirement builders, what could be done to help the small and medium-sized builders, and what generally we can do with Homes England, and what role Homes England and housing associations might be able to play working with us in that economic recovery. I repeat, it's not an exhaustive list, and none of this is agreed. These are all effectively ideas, and they are subject to discussion. And clearly, the government is going to have a lot of calls on its money from all sorts of sectors. And I think we have to understand and respect that coming out of this particular pandemic are going to be cries for help from right across the economy. Our cry is more about helping the economy than it is helping us. But at the same time, clearly the Treasury has to allocate its funding as appropriate. Just looking beyond the pandemic briefly, the slide in front of you now shows some of the items that were on our inbox, if you will, pre the pandemic 3 months ago. These were the top items that were concentrating HBF's mind. There are always items on planning and technical matters, which I haven't listed, but they're always top of HBF's mind, of course. And, what's going to happen to some of these items post to the recovery is a question that I am often asked. And, time doesn't permit me to talk about all of these items today, but let me just pick on three. The environment. We started 2020 with the environment at the top of our priority list, with the government producing an environment bill, which is going to define in law a very tough to deliver objective of the economy going to a net zero economy. And we were asking the question, what role are we going to play in that, and how are we going to deliver that? I really don't think there is any chance post the pandemic of the environment not dominating the agenda going forward. I think the government will be even more focused in that area than it is today. Similarly, on building safety, obviously it's barely 3 years since the Grenfell tragedy, and the consequences of that for the families, clearly forever, for us in terms of building regulations in the here and now, and the government will continue its drive towards ensuring building safety, and that is something we're going to have to continue to work very actively on. And similarly on quality, the announcement the other week, very positive announcement from our point of view, that the government had decided to accept our proposal to move towards a voluntary ombudsman scheme. That is excellent, and we're in the process now of setting that up with Natalie Elphick, as you heard from the Secretary of State, leading that charge for us. But we have to deliver that, and that means we have to make sure that works, because be clear, if it doesn't work, and the slight threat was there from the Secretary of State's comments, then be clear, if it doesn't work, the Secretary of State will mandate. So I think once the pandemic is over, whilst there'll be a lot of focus on the recovery and making sure that the right economic levers are being pulled to enable us to deliver the homes that the country needs and play our role in that very important part of the social fabric of the UK, the issues on the screen, plus many more, will be back at the top of our agenda. And of course, as ever, we will continue to serve you in the best way we can, ensuring that home builders and HBF members' views are represented to government to ensure they understand what will work on a practical basis. So, of course, there is, as ever, so much more that I could talk about. As you know, the range of topics which HBF covers these days has changed dramatically in the 15 years that I've been your chairman. Remarkable number of topics that we talk to government and others about on a daily, weekly basis. But time doesn't permit that. I've gone on probably far too long already. So I'll close at that point. Very happy, as I said earlier, to take questions later. And I'm sure there'll be some interesting remarks coming from Lucian and Robert and David as well. And at the end, we'll all very happily take your questions. So thank you very much indeed for your time and attention. And I look forward to talking to you again later.
So thanks, Stewart. Thanks for that presentation, which was really insightful. I think there's a couple of questions I've really got to ask as a result of the response that we've received on the poll. The first one, obviously, is with regards to the extension to the current Help to Buy scheme, Stewart. That's something that's creating a great deal of concern across the industry and has led to many questions today. Is there anything you can add on in addition to what you said in your presentation, about where things currently stand with regards to the current scheme, which is intended to end at the end of the year?
Well, look, 233 people have voted. I'm looking at my other screen here, and 65% of you have said that Help to Buy is the single most important thing the government could pull a lever on, 30% stamp duty and 5% the rest. So clearly Help to Buy is uppermost in your minds, and we absolutely understand that. But unfortunately, no, Neil, there isn't really a lot I can add to the information that I just, talked through. We have made it abundantly clear to the Chancellor, but to everybody else across government, that this is a major priority for the industry. We have explicitly talked through the December 31st issue, which is a kind of an issue of paramount importance now. We've explained why it's important now, why it matters today to real customers. And as some of you may know, we're starting to get letters, emails at HBF from those real customers asking us, and we're also aware from conversations we're having with members that sales are being lost day by day because of that December 31st practical bill completion date, which you simply can't meet now because of the delays in construction that you've experienced through A, the lockdown, and B, the elongated bill programs that inevitably are a consequence of the way you're having to work, at least for the interim. So I think there is sympathy with that. I think, to be frank, nobody I speak to in government disagrees with the logic of extending that date, but as yet, rather disappointingly, they haven't announced it, and we just have to keep pressing and pressing and pressing. On the bigger issue, as I said, the sort of slightly hotter political potato of what happens to the Help to Buy scheme between next April and its currently slated end date of March the 31st, 2023. Again, those discussions are ongoing, but I think it's, and this may be, not easily acceptable to people in the audience, and I totally understand that frustration, but for government, they've only really started to turn their attention to issues like this in the last week to 10 days, as the government machine has started to move on from the final knockings of how the furlough scheme is going to work and other areas of existing support schemes into the future economic recovery package. And a lot of work is now going on right across industry, not just with the home building sector on that. And we're anticipating that hopefully there will be a July mini budget or some kind of economic statement by the Chancellor.
Question I was going to ask was with regards to the green recovery. You talked about the environment, and I was going to ask about how serious government is with regards to the green recovery, the environmental issues that you mentioned. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll come back to that at the end, because I suspect that our other panelists today will have a view on that as well. So again, just thanks for all your questions, all of you out there. The one thing I should mention right now is for those of you who have been furiously taking notes, the slides and the webinar recording will be available at the beginning of next week. And when ready, we'll send an email out to all the delegates that are here today to let you know. So no need for taking copious notes. So thanks, Stewart, and we will come back to the green recovery piece at the end. So our next presenter, I mentioned at the beginning, we're delighted to have with us today Robert Gardner, who's Chief Economist from the Nationwide. This is going to be a fascinating insight into the challenges facing a lender in the coronavirus pandemic. So over to you, Robert.
Thank you. There are four main areas that I'm going to talk about. So firstly, the impact of the pandemic on the overall economy and what we can tell to date, the policy response, developments in the housing and mortgage market, and then finally how we're approaching forecasting in this very uncertain environment. So first of all, then, what can we say about the impacts on the economy from what we know so far from the pandemic? Well, obviously, we're not all the way through this yet, and the data comes out with a lag. Nevertheless, the scale of the shock to the economy is starting to become evident. So, for example, if we look at output loss, in March alone, the UK economy shrank by almost 6%, and the economy was only in lockdown for just over a week. That's almost a bigger contraction as the economy recorded over the entire financial crisis. And if you look at Q2 in the UK, output loss could easily be another 20% or so, given that the lockdown was for most of that period. And we see this picture around the world. Similarly, if we look at the labour market, again, we see the impact starting to become evident. The US is a good example of just the scale of what we're seeing. The US economy lost about 9 million jobs in a 2-year period during the financial crisis. In the 10-week period from early March this year, around 40 million people registered a first claim for unemployment. So you can see just the scale is on a completely different order of magnitude. Similarly, in the UK, there are about 1.3 million people unemployed, the stock of unemployed people that is in January of this year. And then about 2 million people applied for universal credit in a 6-week period. 25% of the workforce, more than that, in fact, it is now furloughed, 9 million people, and there's another 2.5 million self-employed people that are also being supported by government scheme. So I suppose the difference this time around is that the vast majority of the effects in the economy is due to deliberate policy action taken to control the pandemic, control the spread of the virus. The economy has been deliberately put on ice. So hopefully, as the economy is freed up, that means it can bounce back more quickly. But the way forward is going to be determined to a large extent by how the pandemic itself evolves, and linked to that, the measures the government has to take in order to restrict activity and so on, but also any behavioural responses by households and businesses. That's going to impact activity as well. And finally, and crucially, the type of recovery that we get is also going to depend to a large extent on any long-term damage that's done to the economy as a result of this shock. And that takes us on naturally to the second area that I was going to talk about, which is the impact of policy and the policy response. Now, much of the policy response is clearly geared towards limiting that long-term damage and that scarring effects on the economy. And there are a few strands that we can separate out in terms of the policy response. First of all, if we think about the monetary response, a lot of that has been designed to try and make sure that the financial sector doesn't amplify the shock and make things worse. So if you look at whether it's the reduction in bank rate, additional asset purchases, the liquidity support and funding support schemes, the macroprudential measures, all those are aimed at ensuring the availability of credit to the economy and reducing the cost of credit to try and support activity, households and firms through this difficult period. Same that government loan guarantees are designed towards the same end. Lenders are also trying to do their part, things like payment holidays for borrowers on loans and mortgages and so on. And then we've had a very significant fiscal support put in place, try and support businesses, jobs and people's incomes. So furlough schemes, support for the self-employed, cuts in business rates, grants, all these things. Now, clearly, the fiscal cost is going to be enormous, could easily be 15% of GDP, the budget deficit this year, and that compares with about 10% at the worst point in the financial crisis. I think there's a few important things to say about that, because government debt is also going to rise sharply, probably above 100% of GDP from the 80% or so we were before the financial crisis. So the first thing to say is that this fiscal response is definitely necessary, and it's going to work out a lot cheaper in the long run than not doing it. The damage that not doing it would cause to people's livelihoods and just the long-term prospects of the economy, it's definitely the best solution in the long run. Can we afford it? Absolutely, yes, we can. The UK economy has had much higher debt as a share of GDP in the past. So say at the moment, we were about 80% debt to GDP, public debt, before the pandemic struck. It's probably going to go above 100%. But if you look after World War II, it was over 260%. in the early 20th century, we had 175% debt to GDP for several decades. So it's not by any means something that we haven't experienced before. We can definitely live with that, and it shouldn't cause significant problems. Similarly, if we look internationally, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of over 200%. The thing that people worry about in terms of high public debt levels is it will put upward pressure on market interest rates. Again, there's little danger of that in the near term. Japan again shows, as I say, debt to GDP of over 200%, and yet they've had negative interest rates, even 5-10-year maturities. So it's not something we should worry about. At this point, the UK is not part of the Eurozone, for example. We have our own currency, and that independent monetary policy gives us greater fiscal flexibility that we should absolutely use to make sure we support the economy as best we can. I think that the most important thing on the fiscal front is to make sure we avoid the mistake of tightening policy too soon. The reason why that's particularly important is because monetary policy has become less effective because interest rates are already practically at zero. In fact, the risk of negative interest rates is increasing. It's more important, therefore, that the fiscal side continues to provide that support because interest rates are as low as they are at the moment. So turning now to the housing market and the mortgage market. So I suppose the first thing to say there is that the housing market had actually really been starting to pick up and gain momentum before the pandemic hit the UK, whether it was transactions or house prices. We've seen things edging up. And now clearly things slowed dramatically in April and May as a result of the lockdown and the government advising people quite rightly not to transact during that lockdown period if at all possible. Most recent data is showing the impact of those effects. So, for example, HMRC property transaction data shows transactions down 50% year on year in April. Mortgage approvals were down by even more than that, down 75% more than that, even year on year. House price data also started to show the impact, starting to filter through. So prices fell by 1.7% over the month in May, the largest decline, monthly decline since February 2009. The annual rate of growth slowed to 1.8%, so half the rate that we saw the previous month, which was 3.7% in April. So things starting to filter through. So what happens next is obviously going to depend crucially on what happens in terms of the wider economy, which we're going to come on to in a moment. But worth saying that the pandemic could impact the housing market through a number of different channels. Clearly, behavioural changes and social distancing are going to impact the flow of housing transactions for quite some time to come. But it might also have other impacts that are maybe less obvious. So, for example, we did a survey in May and found that around 15% of people said they were actually considering moving as a result of life in lockdown. A third of people said that they were thinking differently about their home as a result of the outbreak, especially things like the importance of the garden, the need for window space, the importance of the community amenities around them. Another 20% of people said that they'd changed their mind as to what constituted the most important aspects of their home and thinking of changing, making improvements to their home as a result, adding more space and these sorts of things. So it's difficult to say how long lasting some of these behavioural shifts will be, but nevertheless, it's just hints that the impacts could be more wide ranging than maybe you might imagine. Finally, then, how are we thinking about forecasting in this very uncertain environment? Important to say, I think, that at this point, what happens next is not just uncertain, it's essentially unknowable at this point. It's going to depend on how the pandemic evolves, and how restrictions and things are eased, behavioural responses, how effective the policy response is, as we've said already. I think what this means is the only sensible way to proceed is really through scenario analysis, where we think about a whole host of different outcomes and what the implications of those would be and be ready to respond accordingly. And we do that by varying some of the key assumptions about, for example, how long the pandemic might last. Will there be one or multiple waves of infection? How severe the knock-on effects will be? And in particular, the policy response and how effective it is in the short and long term at limiting damage to the economy. And only that way, by thinking about all those different outcomes, can we really make sure that we're ready for all the different things that could come next. And it's also important to say it's not going to be clear which scenario we're in until maybe quite a while after the fact. So, for example, we may see a strong recovery begin, but then if there's another wave of infection, we may see activity slow again. So important just to keep in mind the potential for the economy to take different paths forward, and just to keep that optionality, keep that in mind when taking business decisions. And as if things weren't complex enough, just in terms of thinking about the domestic impact of the pandemic and what that could do to economic prospects. Also, other things we need to keep in mind. First of all, that it's not just the UK effects we need to think about. Obviously, global developments are also important. The UK is still a very open economy, and what happens globally is very important. So how the pandemic evolves internationally, how it impacts other countries is crucial. For example, we think about the US and how that's coping. And also, when we think about the US, it's not just because it's such a large trading nation, but also because of its importance to global market. So important to keep an eye on what's happening internationally as well, and also the question of Brexit and how that will play out. Now, will we see an extension to transition or not? Will we manage to get an agreement before the exit date approaches or not, or rather before the transition period ends or not? And I think that's crucial, because if businesses and households have to cope with an adjustment to WTO arrangements alongside the aftermath of the pandemic, that could be quite difficult to cope with. So important to understand what is going to happen there and how that will play out as well, and keep that in mind. But I'll draw my comments to a close there. Thank you very much for listening.
So thanks, Robert. It's been great to have you here today and providing a fantastic overview of the economy. I think we've got time just for one question. It's clear that from your presentation that there's lots of levers to pull. But in terms of recovery in the house building industry, what for you is the key policy?
Thanks, Neil, and thanks for having me. I think for me, the key thing is really not so much specific measures to support the housing market per se, but making sure that we secure the best recovery that we possibly can. As I said in the presentation, I think key to that is making sure that we don't take away those stimulus measures too soon. We make sure that we minimise the long-term damage to the recovery, and that will ultimately be the best support we can provide for the housing market over the longer term.
Thanks, Robert. That's great. Just to say thanks again for those of you who have completed the poll with regards to the length of time you expect this disruption to last. So there's the majority going for, or 45% going for 1 year. You can see the response we've had to the poll, 258 on the ticker. So I've got to say, you're not watching this by yourself out there, because we know from our production team that there's well over 500 people that joined us for today's event, which is a great response. So thanks for joining us. And many of you will be here to hear from our next speaker, who's Lucian Cook, who's head of research at Savills, a familiar face to those of us in the industry and a regular speaker at HBF Events. So we're very keen to hear from Lucian about his thoughts on what's been going on during the pandemic, and also as a forecaster for the housing market, where he sees things going next. So over to you, Lucian.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So as those of you who've heard me speak before know, I choose my images very carefully. I think last time I presented to the HBF, I had a picture of an automated Australian bricklaying machine, which at the time I suggested was the future of modern methods of construction. This time round, I've gone to the other end of the scale, and I've gone for the early inception of modern methods of construction, and just a demonstration of what can go wrong if you don't follow the plans on the right basis. And I suppose when we talk about the housing market and the impact of COVID-19, the question that we're facing at the moment is really, is this going to turn the housing market upside down? Now, we are fortunate and quite lucky in that we have more readily available data now than perhaps any other time since I've been operating as a researcher in the past 14 years. And the chart which you have in front of you looks at data which is provided by a data provider known as 20CI. And they essentially record every property which is marked as sold subject to contract on a website in any particular week or any particular month. And we can also see in the lines, as opposed to the bars, what has happened to new instruction levels. And you can see here the very dramatic impact which the lockdown has had on the UK housing market, with the number of properties being marked sold subject to contract falling by 83% compared to the same month last year in April. But some encouraging news coming out than in May 2020, where they got up to 41%. What I suppose is more interesting is what's happened on a week-by-week basis, and we can take that data and update it to the week ending the 7th of June. And there you can see week on week, as the lockdown has eased, a very strong and perhaps surprisingly strong improvement in transaction levels. So a level of resolve in the housing market, which I think, given the economic context, none of us anticipated. What I suppose is also interesting is that generally we've seen the number of properties which are marked as sold subject to contract and therefore coming off the market has been higher than the level of new instructions over each of the final 2 weeks of that slide. And that would suggest that there is a clear place in what could be a relatively poorly supplied market for new build. The bigger question, though, is whether or not this trend can continue. Is this simply a build-up of pent-up demand, or is it something which can be sustained? And I suppose the big question there is, how does it sit against consumer confidence? So if we have a look at consumer confidence back in May last year, you can see generally that was just marginally positive, albeit that at this time in May last year, people had concerns about their personal finances, and they were pretty broadly neutral about what they felt about it being a good time for the purchase of a major item such as a car or indeed a home. It is the weakness of that consumer confidence index that we see at the current time, particularly that major purchase index at a reading of minus 41% in May 2020, which suggests to us that the strength and the resolve that we see in transaction numbers, as and when we start to see pent-up demand dissipate, that we may well not see the level of transaction activity that we've seen recently continue through to the end of the year. But it's not all doom and gloom, because I think there are a number of features why what we're witnessing now is different to previous housing market downturns. And here I'd like to thank Stewart Baseley for providing the image of the point in time when he started his working career. It is, of course, the Great Depression of 1929. But why is the current situation different to that? And I think there's probably to that, and actually the downturns that we saw in the early 1990s and post-credit crunch. And there's a couple of key reasons. The first one is that house price growth in the run-up to the crisis has been modest. Whether you look over the period in the year before COVID-19, the 5 years before that, or 10 years, much less significant levels of price growth. And indeed, interest rates have been cut very rapidly, meaning for those with a stable income, affordability is unlikely to be an issue in the housing market at the current time. As, if not more important to that, is the prospect that the economic downturn will take a distinct V-shaped, albeit that it's deep and possibly lopsided, but that gives an opportunity for consumer confidence to improve. Furthermore, the government has taken relatively swift action to support jobs and earnings through its extended furlough scheme, and lenders themselves have taken a fairly benevolent approach to mortgage lending with the extension of mortgage holidays. So all of that takes some pressure off the housing market. What does that mean? Well, again, I'm grateful for Stewart for providing two of his favourite images. I asked him to provide images of a V-shape. These were the two that he came up with. What does that V-shape mean for the UK housing market? Well, I think there is still the distinct possibility of prices softening. They're not like anything to the same degree that we've seen in previous downturns, down by in the order of 5 to 10%. Because of this incredibly low interest rate environment, and in the context of previous downturns, a relatively swift recovery in employment, that certainly leaves capacity for medium-term house price growth. We know, as we've seen previously, there is likely to be short-term disruption to transaction levels, and the sustained recovery of those is going to be heavily dependent on buyer and seller confidence in their household finances and indeed in their job security. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, we've said that we think prices in the short term could fall by in the order of 5 to 10%. We think sustained recovery in house prices is likely really to be delayed until 2022, but there is the prospect of some very strong house price growth as the economy recovers in that year and interest rates stay low. And that allows us to stand by our house price forecasts of around 15% across the UK as a whole over the period of the next 5 years. One of the reasons why we don't think the recovery will come back in 2021 is the possibility of an overhang of Brexit negotiations and extension of the transition period. In terms of transactions, and I suppose this is all important to the development industry, there is no doubt that we will see a significant fall in transaction levels in 2020 compared to those in 2019, when they were around what appears to be the new normal of 1.2 million a year. And that 1.2 million a year, let's not forget, was driven by pretty strong first-time buyer activity, subject to the fact that people were trading up less often, something that perhaps may change as a result of COVID. And we saw certain parts of the market under significant pressure buy-to-let. But still, in 2019, supporting those transaction levels about 1.2. In terms of what we see in 2020, we estimated at the beginning of the lockdown that transaction levels might this year end up between 566,000 and 745,000. The simple reopening of the housing market suggests that this year it is likely that they will be at the top end of that range. In contrast, if you look to next year, I suspect they're likely to be towards the bottom of the range that we've suggested, if not perhaps a little lower than that, because over the period of the lockdown, the precise impact and the depth of the impact which will have on the UK economy and jobs has become more evident, and it is clear that that is going to take longer to recover than perhaps all of us initially suggested. And then much in line with a bounce in house prices in 2022, the prospect that house prices in that year are somewhat higher. In terms of how that plays out regionally, one of the things that we know historically is that we have been at a changed point in the housing market cycle, one where generally London and the South East look relatively highly priced relative to the UK and therefore cannot sustain the same level of house price growth. Whereas if you look to the Midlands and the north of the country, much more capacity for house price growth, largely because of what's happened in the period since between 2005, 2006 and 2016. I think the impact of COVID-19 on the economy and particularly unemployment could interrupt that particular cycle. So if we look at the downside forecasts for unemployment that come out of the Oxford Economics, you can see a stronger employment market between 2019 and 2022 in London and London's hinterland. So the potential for the beginning of the recovery to be stronger in London and the South East before we see a resumption of the normal cycle, where over the next 5 years we still have more capacity and stronger house price growth across the period as a whole in the markets of the Midlands, the North, Scotland, and indeed Wales. What do we know about then about the house building industry? Where has that taken us? Well, clearly one of the major impacts lockdown has been on the ability of people to get on site and their levels of production. Some good news clearly in that respect. According to Glenigan, at the end of May, 84% of sites were open, a significant increase from the 58% which we saw in early April. And Build UK telling us that productivity on those sites having gone from 29% to a much more healthy figure of 67%, but still an anticipation that over the remainder of this year, there will be physical constraints on production capacity, which reduces the risk of a significant overhang of unsold stock if the level of transactions which we've seen over recent weeks fails to be sustained over the remainder of the year. In terms of stuff coming down through the pipeline, we can have a look at what's happened to planning consents. And those planning consents from people taking a medium-term view beyond COVID-19 are relatively robust. So relatively little impact on the number of sites above 10 units which are obtaining planning consent. Those numbers remaining relatively robust. So what is it from a housing delivery perspective? Here with the image I've taken, we've moved on. Again, this comes from Stewart's private collections of photos. This is a little later in his career at the height of the Newtown movement. So we've talked already about physical constraints on delivery and the prospect that house builders are likely to be building into relatively uncertain market conditions over the course of this year and next. What is that likely to mean? Well, it is, of course, going to place much greater reliance on Help to Buy, and particularly for the smaller and medium-sized house builders, intervention from Homes England, whether that's funding infrastructure, whether that's providing funding to sustain levels of production. Those two areas are going to be really critically important. Of course, in the event that we see transaction levels at a lower level and production continue, then in order to maintain rates of sale, we may well see some recourse of bulk sales into what is a particularly strong and growing build-to-rent market. From a policy perspective, I suppose what we've learned from COVID-19 is to value the NHS much more greatly, and indeed other key workers, than perhaps we have done in the past. And I suspect that that will be reflected in planning policy. It will be interesting to see whether or not homes, as an example, becomes more closely targeted to key worker accommodation. What that will do, I think, is present much more opportunities for housing associations and indeed local authorities. But of course, for those organisations, there are some competing financial pressures coming not just from fire safety, but also from their obligations around zero carbon. And I think it's against that context that you've seen some funds and investors see the social benefits they have from being involved in the development of affordable housing. And it's for that reason that I think we could see the continued rise of the for-profit registered provider or housing association sector backed up by private equity. So very much within the ESG agenda, the S playing out, I think, in housing policy as we go forward. One of the things which we have done over the course of the lockdown is survey our registered buyers to see how COVID-19 has changed their attitudes. And this is taken from a survey which we conducted at the back end of April. And one of the things that it tells us by looking at the bars and the columns on the left-hand side is that people are thinking much more closely about the space that they occupy. So the experience of the lockdown making those under 50 consider whether or not they have stretched themselves as far as they can within their existing home and actually have reached a point where upsizing is a necessity given the experience which they've had over the period of the last 2 to 3 months. What I suppose we found interesting was around that sort of right-sizing agenda. So we also have seen an increased propensity for people to consider downsizing. Those over the age of 50. And I think that's one thing that will continue to support the retirement housing market as we go forward, a market which we think is fundamentally undersupplied and where there remains significant opportunity for innovation. In terms of things that perhaps might be more obvious, clearly the experience of working from home has meant that people using Zoom, using Teams, using all of the new tools which they have at their disposal, believe that working from home more regularly is a pretty significant likelihood as we go forward. What's interesting then, I suppose, is whilst they want to work from home and they need the space to be able to do that, they are perhaps not quite as keen to accept a longer commute. And that suggests that you're more likely to get a concentration of demand in some of the suburban areas and rural areas which remain in decent striking distance of the major employment markets, whether that's London, Birmingham, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Cardiff, or indeed wherever. So I suspect that will be the accessible countryside and suburban areas with more space that will benefit from that particular change in outlook. The other thing that we looked at then was how it impacted on property attributes, and no surprise there that people more carefully valuing their accessibility to Wi-Fi, the ability to have more garden and outside space, which may change the way we plan our spaces within new developments and taking renewed importance within placemaking. Having a separate space to work from home may well change the layout of the stock which is being delivered. What also, I suppose, is quite interesting is that owners are valuing a little bit more the size and the number of rooms over the character or architectural style of the property that they're considering. Now, slapping the bang in the middle of all of those, of course, is this issue around environmental credentials, or what we can see here in terms of environmental credentials, which by the magical press of a button, I've changed to green. And there you can see, of the people who we surveyed, some 30% felt that the environmental credentials of what they were buying had become more important. And this, I suppose, is that awakening of their environmental conscience, which has been accelerated by COVID-19, which could have perhaps the most significant long-term impact on the development industry and the housing market more generally. And what we also know is that within the second-hand market, those more environmentally friendly, energy efficient buildings with better environmental credentials do indeed carry something of a premium. So this involved us looking at all of the data that was available from EPC certificates matched against land registry sales and calculating the average pounds per square foot of those sales. And you can see there for stock which is A or B rated, a premium of 10 to 11%, whereas the least energy efficient in F or G, you can see there that prices relative to the average, the band D property, somewhat lower. Now, of course, for the new build industry, pretty much all stock has to be and is within that A and B category. But the premium which this shows is an important part, I suppose, of underpinning the new build premium that we know exists within nations. But I wanted really then to finish, if I could, by looking at what other impacts those that growing environmental awareness may have for the housing market and the industry more generally. So this is my blue sky thinking. In reality, I couldn't find a slide which I liked a great deal to represent blue sky thinking. So I've gone the other way and I've gone to Blue Sky Mining, an exceptional new wave rock album from 1990 from the Australian band Midnight Oil. If anyone can find the tenuous link from these images to the environmental concerns and the impact of the environment, then Stewart tells me that he will gladly give them half an hour's free access to his extensive wine collection. So answers on a postcard, please. So what impact do we think this environmental awakening could have on the market more generally? Well, we already have minimum EPC standards for lettings, and it is very easy to see a situation where those are tightened and widened in terms of ability to let, sell or do anything else with residential property. That has the potential to create and crystallize latent liabilities in existing housing stock, as people essentially are required to look at the energy performance and environmental credentials of their home and do something about it. That, we think, has the potential both to affect accessibility to mortgage debt and potentially even its cost, as we see the ESG agenda of the lenders start to differentiate between those properties with good, medium, moderate or poor eco credentials. From a development perspective, as we're already seeing, we see it extensively through the planning system, but I think that the traffic is only likely to be one way in this respect. So that increasingly we will see ESG will affect what we build, how that is serviced, whether that be through the energy which is put into the house, whether it be how it's connected into the transport infrastructure. You know, all of those things I think will play out with more importance as we go forward. Already it impacts where we build it, but perhaps more so with a much greater emphasis on living and working within a much tighter radius, and also how we build it. I suspect, given the ability to control the quality of output through MMC, it may well act as a further catalyst for the expansion of MMC as a means of delivering housing, not least given the need to sustain production to meet house building targets. So from there, I suppose, what does it mean for the industry? Well, I suspect the next logical step will be that house builders will continue to develop and build on their eco credentials, because all of that would suggest that those eco credentials are the next natural extension to placemaking and the building of a community, which of course is the game that we are all in. And that's me done. I hope you found that useful. I'm going to hand you back now. Thank you.
So thanks, Lucian. What a great presentation, great slides, very, very engaging. You mentioned there of eco-credentials. That's something I will come back to at the end and ask all the panelists about the green recovery. I think we've got time for one question, Lucian. I'm sure the audience will be interested in this one, which is, are you surprised by how well the market is holding up?
Yeah, I mean, I am quite surprised, actually, particularly in terms of those transaction levels. We knew that there was going to be some pent-up demand, but the extent of that pent-up demand has been surprising. Of course, what that isn't is a guarantee as to how long it will last going forward. And I think it's for that reason that Help to Buy is going to be absolutely critical in terms of underpinning the market and sustaining production if the government's going to meet its house building targets.
Okay. Thanks, Lucian. So we look forward to hearing from you on the panel that I mentioned a few moments ago. So thanks again for your presentation. Great to see an obscure reference to midnight oil, but much more natural references to Stewart Baseley, which always go down well at these events. So thanks again, Lucian. Okay, so just to introduce our next speaker, as I mentioned at the beginning of the event, is David Campbell. David's Commercial Director at NHBC. But although he's new to his role at NHBC, having started in January, David's well known around the industry, having worked for house builders over a number of years, most recently at Telford Homes. So David's going to talk to us about what NHBC's been up to during the pandemic, during these challenging times. So over to you, David.
Good morning. I am David Campbell, Commercial Director at NHBC, and I'm delighted to be with you all this morning. I'd like to start my presentation to you by highlighting some of the ways we've been supporting and working with the industry during these unprecedented times. We've been supporting house builders where sites remained active throughout the pandemic, with inspections carried out on site to strict health and safety protocols. We are now actively ramping up our support and working closely with our house builder and developer customers, as they've been busy reopening sites in recent weeks, with regular communication to ensure we have sufficient resources available at all times. We've also dramatically upped our online training services, recognising the heightened need for them during this time, and have webinars over recent weeks, which is still continuing. We have had a fantastic response to this initiative, and to date, over 30,000 participants have benefited from them since we went into lockdown. Many site teams have been particularly appreciative in their feedback, having been furloughed for much of that time. Despite what has happened on site in recent months, we continue to move forward with Pride in the Job Awards, which this year are celebrating their 40th anniversary. Quality Award winners will be announced on the 19th of June, as previously planned, and we are very keen to be able to hold the latter stages of the competition later this year. Fingers crossed we can carry on judging on site in the months ahead to enable us to move forward with the regionals and seals of excellence. At this time of exceptional uncertainty, it is worth briefly reflecting on NHBC's long history and on the strength of our business, which has withstood many challenges over the decades, never faltering in our protection of homeowners, nor in our determination to improve the quality of house building. Like all responsible companies, we have taken steps to protect our business in response to the very challenging conditions of the last few months. This has included furloughing employees where demand has fallen, for example, in inspection and customer services. And a good number of those colleagues are coming back into the business now that production is ramping up again on site. Due to the substantial financial challenges to our business, which began long before COVID-19, we have had to carry out a fundamental reset of build mark warranty pricing that better aligns premiums to risk. This has meant higher charges for apartments compared to residential houses and significant price increases for many of our customers from the beginning of this month. We recognise that the timing of this is less than ideal. However, we have had no choice but to take this course of action to ensure that our business is financially sustainable and to restore our capital reserves, which have been hit hard in the last 3 years by large loss development and fire stopping and cladding related claims. We appreciate greatly the pragmatic acceptance we have received from across the industry, which in turn will allow us to support our customers, not just with our warranty, but also in the other ways we partner with you and your teams to improve quality and standards. Rest assured, we are looking at every opportunity to increase our efficiencies and effectiveness within our business, right-sizing the organisation and freeing up resources to invest in improving our proposition and service for our customers. We are also reviewing our reinsurance programme, which will deliver improved capital efficiencies as well as limit our risk exposure. Our core purpose remains the same: to protect policyholders and support the delivery of high-quality new homes. Right now, the longer-term impact of the pandemic on the economy, on our customers, and on consumer confidence is very difficult to predict. As we look ahead, we know conditions will remain challenging. However, it is a time when our capacity, insights, and expertise have come to the fore as we work closely with our registered customers on their remobilisation plans. This desire to support our customers and to aid economic recovery not result in any compromise to our standards nor the rigours in our approach. We will remain committed to raising home building standards and protecting homeowners both now and into the future. We are continually investing in services that help our customers improve construction quality. Our inspection teams carried out over 1 million on-site inspections during the recent financial year, building positive relationships with site managers and also providing valued feedback to our customers. We use the data and insights from inspections along with our claims history to develop a range of construction quality services to add to our construction quality reviews, which we are rapidly rolling out as things expand. Positive impacts of these reviews are already showing a 6% increase in good to better build stages versus last year. We have further developed our inspection regime, introducing intermediate inspections, pre-handover benchmark inspections, and enhanced attention to fire-related safety issues, with increased scrutiny on apartment buildings focusing on facade and pre-plaster elements. We are also enhancing our market-leading technical risk management offering via piloting with a number of our customers of a new TRM approach and tools, which we are planning to roll out later this year. During April and May of this year, Buildmark warranty registrations, which amount for around 80% of the new homes market, unsurprisingly dropped to historically low levels. And whilst we expect them to pick up again as work resumes, it will take some time to get back to previous volumes. Whatever the pace of recovery, we will continue to resource our business appropriately to ensure that we are well placed to support the industry in the challenging times ahead. New parts L and F of the building regulations are due to come into effect later this year as the first step in achieving the Future Homes Standard, which will present some challenges given all that has happened this year so far. On building and fire safety, we have provided the full range of our expertise and knowledge to government, ensuring our unique perspective as an approved inspector and warranty insurer is informing policy development. We will continue to work closely with the government and building safety regulator as they establish a robust, effective building control system that will contribute to the creation of safe new homes across the country. We also welcome increased government scrutiny on the quality of new homes and ensuring they're built safely with the health of everybody working on site of paramount importance. The government's commitment to the introduction of a new homes ombudsman is an important development and one which we welcome and support. We have joined the newly formed Shadow New Homes Quality Board, which will commission the appointment of the ombudsman. We look forward to contributing to its important work. Use of non-conventional construction methods continues to increase. Some major builders are developing their own capability across panelised and volumetric systems, whilst independent manufacturers are becoming more prominent and scalable. Many developers are looking to use such systems as a means of delivering consistent quality homes at pace, whilst positively impacting the skills shortage. At NHBC, we are supporting MMC through our dedicated team, which reviews new products, components and systems to assess whether they are acceptable for our Buildmark New Homes warranty. We will be launching a new bespoke MMC service called NHBC Accepts in the next few months. Climate change is another key area of focus. The Future Homes Standard to be introduced in 2025 will need concerted cross-industry engagement. Despite the challenges caused by COVID-19 and indeed by Brexit negotiations, This will come to the fore again for government. There is a determination to make a step change in the UK's approach to the environmental agenda, and certainly for this to happen within house building. We will be working to support our customers to meet the challenges of the new building regulations, and along with HBF and others, to help establish a viable roadmap in this important area. I'd like to conclude my presentation to you today by firstly thanking both Neil and Stewart for the opportunity to present to you today, and also highlight three important things to take away. Firstly, our inspection teams are geared up and ready to support you in getting your sites back to work. If you need any help, we're here for you. Right now with us, you can learn from home, from the office, or on site. All you need to do is provide the training room, or alternatively, we have other online options available. Our desire to aid economic recovery and support our customers will not lead to any compromise in our standards nor our thoroughness of approach. We can remain committed to raising home building standards, protecting homeowners, both now and into the future. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand you back to Neil.
Thanks, David, for the presentation. That's been great. And thanks to you all as well for contributing to the word cloud, giving us an idea of where you're currently focused on the technical side of your businesses. So the slide amongst you may have spotted that David provided a pre-record for technical reasons of his presentation, but he is here live today. He's lost a tie seemingly as well. So just a quick question now, David, before we go to the panel as a whole. So clearly things are moving quite quickly. As of today, what's NHBC's focus?
Yeah, very much keeping in touch with our builder customers and developers first and foremost. Particularly, we were there really from the commencement of lockdown, helping them to shut down sites safely, and equally continue our inspection services for those that were open at the time. But now we are very heavily involved in getting our resource up to support them in the remobilisation process. So that's taking a lot of our time. We're looking forward to things like restarting our construction, which I know a lot are keen on and use for their benchmarking. So there to support the industry, first and foremost, with all of the range of services getting back up and running that we've had to pause during the lockdown.
Thanks, David. So from speaking to HBF members, I do know that NHBC's willingness and ability to provide an inspection service on a residual basis to those who needed it was very gratefully received. So thanks for doing that, and thanks for being with us today. So just to say again to all of you who are in the office or at home listening to this, that the slides and the webinar recording will be available at the beginning of next week. And when it's ready, we'll let you all know so you can access the information that's been handed out today. But for the final part of today, I'm delighted that we've got together the collection of speakers that you've heard today: Stewart Baseley, Robert Gardner, Lucian Cook, and David Campbell, who you heard from just then. And we've received hundreds of questions online today. We'll do our best to, within the package that we send out next week, we'll provide some answers to those questions. We'll pick them up individually as we can. And also it helps to steer this next and final session of today's debate. So first question from me to all of our panelists is with regards to the new normal and the changes that may arise as a result of the pandemic. We talk a lot about the things that are going to change in our lives and in business going forward. So just from your organisational perspective, maybe from a personal perspective as well, just give us some views on how you see things, how you will operate, and how your businesses will operate going forward. So I'll go to Stewart first. Stewart, how do you see things changing as a result of the pandemic?
Thanks, Neil. Well, it's pressing. I think we will do things differently in the future. I suspect we will revert to having quite a lot of physical meetings because there are benefits I think HBF members get actually getting together and having the opportunity to network and have a quiet chat and so on. But I think we'll do a lot more of this. You know, it's remarkable as we approach 12 o'clock, we still have 550 plus people online. And that sort of, everybody's back to work in some shape or form, whether they're at home or in the office or out on site. So that demonstrates the level of interest, the thirst for information that exists. And it isn't always easy or practical for people to get to physical meetings. So I think from an HBF perspective, whilst I hope we can get back into our offices sooner rather than later, although London, of course, is going to be complicated because of transport issues, we will do more of this in the future to keep a more regular more regularly in touch with the depth of membership that we have.
Thanks, Stewart. So Robert Gardner from Nationwide. Clearly, you outlined some challenges for Nationwide as an organisation, and the huge demand that has come through for things like mortgage holidays and the challenges that must have posed for an organisation with call centres and so on must be huge. But also from in terms of being a lender and the amounts of some of the challenges there for you as well. How do you see things going forward, and what lasting changes do you see as a result of the pandemic?
I think in terms of the way that we work as an organisation, it's sort of shown us how agile we can be, because we've had to be in this environment. And I think the other main thing that's happened is the move towards digital for our customers, as well as the way that we work, obviously. That is going to only accelerate through this process, as sort of social distancing has required it now, but is also people have hopefully seen that there are some real advantages to that too, both in terms of working and home life, obviously, but also in terms of how they conduct their financial activities as well, and how much more convenient and time saving that can be for many people. So I think that trend will definitely be something that stays with us, I think.
Thanks, Robert. Lucian, over to you from a Savills perspective, and thinking about how you operate and how you see the market that you play into. What sort of changes can you see coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably going to respond to an environment where people put much more emphasis on space and just the way things are laid out, and also environmental credentials. So, placemaking has gathered fairly significant momentum over the past 5 years and indeed a decade. I think it will add to that and probably give it a new dimension, particularly around the environmental piece. Especially if you find that the government puts investment in green energy towards the top of the agenda to re-stimulate the economy. And that will mean that the skill sets that you need, whether it's with our planners, whether it's the people who are buying and selling sites, or indeed stock, they'll change. They will need to acquire new skill sets, as I suspect most of the industry will.
Thanks, Lucian. I think I'm definitely going to come back to the green aspects that you mentioned there, the eco-credentials, as you called them in your presentation. And over to David Campbell at NHBC. David, so you've got an office-based and a remote workforce. How do you see the changes that you've had to adapt to during the pandemic play out longer term? What do you think is going to stick?
I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of change. Much of it around balance probably would be the thing that would strike me. In the context that we, as you rightly described, we have a business model where a lot of our teams are actually remotely based already, so there's no real change for them. But equally, I think probably shared by most businesses in the country, there was a real concern that things like IT infrastructure would stand up to a huge element of the workforce actually being based from home for a significant period of time. And actually, that's been a real revelation, and I think there will be more of a balance between home and office working. But just picking up the comment Stewart made, I think there is a real sort of need to have that face-to-face report at a time, and I think certainly we find that with the customer base, that we get a lot more out of face-to-face meetings from time to time. I think that will become more balanced, so the more routine meetings may well be virtual, but the more strategic ones or the more further planning will probably still be face-to-face. So a bit of a balance between the two, I think.
Thanks, David. So I mentioned green recovery a few times, and I think you've all touched on the environment in some way or another. And I think this is quite an important question that I should put to you. So as we look now towards an economic recovery, but we heard talk of a green recovery. Can I just ask you all what that means to you, and whether you think the government is serious about a green recovery, and how that will play out in your organisations and the markets that you play into? So I think this time, actually, I'll go to David first, actually, David Campbell from NHBC. So from your point of view, in terms of the challenges of climate change and the environment, where do you think we're at and where we're going?
Well, firstly, I think our view is very much it is a key area of focus. The Future Home Standard to be introduced in 2025 it is certainly the direction of travel that we believe is the right one, but it's certainly going to need a lot of cross-industry engagement. And we'll be working very hard to support not only our customers, but also be part of those pivotal discussions of planning to make sure it really is the serious step forward that it bodes to be. So yeah, very much behind it. Indeed, we're looking at our own carbon footprint quite closely at the moment as well. So I think it's coming. So we need to be prepared for it and deal with it in the right way as an industry collective.
Okay, thanks, David. And Lucy, and this is something you touched on in your presentation. I think it's pretty clear that you see this as being a big driver for change from a consumer point of view and a business point of view. So maybe just a bit more from you on how you see this going forward and the importance of a green recovery.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge subject, isn't it? If you just take one area, which is the rise of the electric car, you know, I suspect that you will see the experience which we've had of lockdown and that reawakening or the awakening of our environmental conscious just drive that further forward. You know, it's an area where we know it, just developing that type of vehicle and everything that goes with it could generate significant economic activity. Therefore, you would have thought the government would want to get behind it. And of course, what it will mean is that you need to have a fairly extensive charging infrastructure, particularly through new developments. And, you know, that's just one way I think it will play out. I think it will also affect where we're looking to build. You know, you've got this sort of slight trade-off between wanting to minimize number of journeys and length of journeys, which pushes you towards urban regeneration and extension of major settlements, but you've then, on the flip side, got this drive for people to want to reconnect with the countryside a bit more. So, yeah. You know, that I think, I mean, I suspect we did a planning on sustainability, I think 2 days ago, and just the land around rail stations. Again, I think it's going to bring that into focus very, very significantly and what the potential is there without really adversely eating into the green belt.
Thanks, Lucian. I think I'll turn to planning in a moment, actually. That's quite important. So Robert Gardner from Nationwide, when we talk about a green recovery, and I guess for those of us in the house building industry, we're well used to thinking about changes to building regulations, and David mentioned the future home standards. But dealing with the impact of climate change we're not alone in having to deal with that. From a nationwide point of view, as a lender and thinking about green mortgages, and also from a regulatory point of view, I know there's some challenges as well. But what are your views about how the future environmental challenges and the green recovery play into Nationwide's agenda?
So I think obviously the government is going to be front and centre in setting the incentives to drive us in that direction, and hopefully it'll be a key part of the decision making right the way across government. So when they're looking to tackle issues, getting those incentives right and driving us towards a greener outcome is hopefully where we'll go. So, for example, if they do seek to tackle the thorny issue of, say, property taxation, that would be a good opportunity to try and align incentives and drive the right behaviours. So that would be important. But from a lender's perspective, as you say, we need to do our part as well and drive the right behaviour. So, for example, before the pandemic, we offered our members a range of mortgages where we tried to incentivise an improvement or move towards greener outcomes. So we offered, for example, preferential rates on mortgages if people bought an EPC A-rated new build home. Similarly, we were offering discounted rates on home improvements if they were to try and retrofit and make the housing stock greener. So those are just a couple of examples of the way where I think it's not just up to government to get the incentives right, but also for lenders and others to work in that direction and help deliver that greener outcome that we all need to see.
Thanks, Robert. That's great. Stewart, just before I come to you, I did say I was going to take or pose a question on planning. I think in the interest of time, I just to let all of our delegates who are still watching, and there's many hundreds of you still here, just know we've gone over our allotted time. So just to let you know right now that the next of these events will be very much focused on planning. We've got an agenda lined up, which will be led partly by Andrew Whitaker, our planning director. So I'm sorry we'll not have time to get to planning today, but just to whet your appetite and to let you know that the next of these events we're very much focused on the planning agenda. So Stewart, I think probably the final question for today, which I'll pose to you, which is on this green recovery, the environment. It's been a big part of HBF, a big part of your time at HBF, but there's loads of challenges going on. Do you think the government and the industry is serious about playing its part in tackling climate change?
So the answer to your question, Neil, I think is yes. Both industry and government are absolutely serious, and it was well demonstrated by the summit that we kicked off the year with back at the early part of January. But look, make no mistake, the difference this time around between the government's environmental objectives and previous, say, the zero carbon objectives from 15 years ago, is that this time the environment program is enshrined in law. And once something becomes enshrined in law, it is not just an objective, but a requirement for everybody to seek to achieve it. And that is very different to having the ambition, which they had 15 years ago for zero carbon. So a net zero economy is enshrined in law, and there will be a raft of primary legislation that comes out to back that up. But I'm very heartened by what the Nationwide did before the lockdown. You know, some of those initiatives, absolutely fantastic to see. And clearly, as was said by Robert, you know, it's about everybody playing their part. And I know home builders are committed to playing their part as well, but it does require significant joined up thinking. It is very easy to talk about electric car charging points, for example, in new homes, and why would anybody want to object to that? And I can only imagine the demand for that is going to grow enormously, partly as a consequence of the experience of the last 3 months. But the reality is the grid has to be able to provide sufficient juice. What people expect is to plug their car in at night in the same way as they do their iPhone. And when they come up down in the morning, it's fully charged. And for that to happen, you need, you know, obviously the grid has to be able to cope with that level of demand. So there is a real joined up effort here. And that's why we kickstarted this process in January with that summit, and why we will continue that process once we're back to anything like a normal life.
Yeah, and I think unprecedented and unmute are two new words of the year, aren't they? Actually, so thanks, Stewart. That's great to hear, and I can only echo that the commitment to future home standards is definitely there. Those of you that have asked questions, those delegates that have asked questions about Part L, that's something we're talking to MHCLG about on a very regular basis, because although we do have this longer term commitment, we can see that because of the current challenges caused by the pandemic, actually achieving the step change in 2020 that Part L building regulations on energy conservation requires is going to be a big challenge. That's something we're talking to government about on a very regular basis. We expect to hear some news soon, and as soon as we do, we will let our members know. So that's us done for today. At HBF's first live webinar. We look forward to catching up face to face in due course. But as I mentioned a moment ago, we are going to run more of these. It's undoubtedly been a big success in terms of numbers. We've got a fantastic lineup, and we hope that these events will fill in the meantime until we can all begin to meet up again. So I just would like to say thank you to everyone who's helped to arrange today's event behind the scenes. But a big special thanks to today's presenters from Robert Gardner from Nationwide, Lucian Cook from Savills, David Campbell from NHBC, and of course our very own Stewart Baseley. And I think you'll all agree it was great to get a video message, such a positive message from Robert Jenrick, and his support from the industry will have been noted by us all. So until next time, I'd just like to say thank you from everybody at HBF. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.